My name is Miranda. Um, um, I am from the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, and I will be moderating this webinar session. Just a quick overview of the house rules. So this is a 90-minute webinar. As webinars, our attendees have limited function, but we encourage everyone to use the chat button for any questions or comments or inputs that you have during the discussion. We'll also have a session towards the end, a Q&A portion for our participants. Just let us know, raise your hand or type in the chat if you want to speak. We'll unmute your mics and let you speak, but we also encourage during the discussion or during the presentations of our speakers to use the Q&A function in case you have questions, and please address your questions to the speakers to which you want answers from. Also, this session is being recorded, so we hope that there's no problem with that to any one of you. And since many of the attendees are also in Asia, whose English is not their native language, we encourage everyone to please speak slowly. So without further ado, I would like now to open our webinar session. I'd call on our first speaker, who is who is representing the International Trade Union Confederation, and also the trade union focal point in the UNFCCC, Bert De Wel, to introduce us what just transition, the concept of just transition is, the overview, brief history, and what is it all about. I hand over the mic now to Bert. Over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Claire, and thank you very much the Asia-Europe People's Forum and the Asia People's Movement and on Debt and Development organization to set up this interesting webinar and to invite the ITUC to share our views on this. I saw on the program that I was from I don't know what, from Ukraine, and this is not correct. I'm from the ITUC, the International Trade Union Confederation. Kiev is 2,000 kilometers from here. I'm based in Brussels. But the ITUC represents more than 300 trade unions in more than 160 countries. So we are a global organization representing global North and global South trade unions, altogether some 220 million workers. So we are the main voice of the organized workers organized in free trade unions. As indicated, I'm the focal point for the trade unions, which means that I have to coordinate the work of the trade unions at the UNFCCC, also at UNEP, and I do it based on the climate work, the priorities of our affiliates. I'm the bridge in between them. In order to be effective at the global level, our unions have to follow, and vice versa. The global level, what's agreed at the UNFCCC, influences and facilitates the works of our trade unions on the ground. Claire asked to say something about the origins of just transition. The word itself, just transition, was first used in the 80s in the US and Canada, where the trade unions used it as a concept to deal with the growing impact of environmental problems and how trade unions had to work with it. At the same time in Europe, also the first collaborations of trade unions with the environmental movement started. So in the 80s, for example, I was a long time engaged in Arbeid en Milieu, Labor and Environment, a Belgian Flemish trade union organization that joins the environment movement and the trade unions, which was already set up in 1987. So the way they did not use the words just transition, but the concept was the same. In the beginning, we spoke a lot about no jobs on a dead planet to raise awareness with the trade unions. Then we translated it, transformed it into decent jobs on a living planet. And out of this, the concept of just transition grew. In the beginning, the focus was very much of having it integrated in the UNFCCC agreements. And after a first mention at the COP in Cancun, we finally arrived at having just transition referred to in the Paris Agreement. It's very important to stress that just transition is there together with the other rights paragraphs, the rights to food, the right for indigenous people, the participation, the protection of human rights. Just transition is part of these rights-based paragraphs that parties have to take into account in their work. I very much want to stress what exactly is mentioned in the Paris Agreement. It's about the imperative of a just transition of the workforce with the creation of decent work and quality jobs. So right from the start in the Paris Agreement, the more than 180 countries have agreed on the labor focus of the concept of just transition. This is, of course, crucial for us. And maybe for many countries, it's not always so easy to understand what it means. Sometimes it gets softened up to maximize the environmental impact, minimize the social impact. No, it's about decent work and quality jobs. And we stress that very much. And also then we refer to the ILO, the International Labour Organization, which is like the sister organization of the UNFCCC, a UN body that deals with labor issues. And in the same year as the Paris Agreement was agreed, the ILO agreed on guidelines for a just transition that help countries, parties to set up just transition policies. And of course, these policies are different in different countries. They are different in the Philippines compared to Germany. They're even different in Germany compared with Poland, a neighbor country. And we need policies that are adapted to the local situations. There are a few, three main aspects that are crucial from our perspective about this just transition. And the first is to set up investment and jobs plans. We know that the impact of climate change, the impact of climate policies, the transition from fossil fuel sectors to renewable energy sectors will create a lot of jobs. The ILO has done studies about it, how many jobs will be created, but there will also be jobs lost. And that's where these plans, these investment and job plans have to deal with. They have to see, they have to guarantee that the new jobs that are created are good quality jobs, and that the people that lose their job are being protected, receive coverage in the transition to low carbon economies. We think that this focus on job creation, which refers also to skills development, and some people will have to do new jobs, needs to be put into place with plans, and governments have to drive these plans. The second aspect is social dialogue. This is also crucial for us. Nothing about us without us. Workers are affected, so workers need a voice on the table on these climate policies. Workers are not the victims of the transition. They are the actors. They need to be part of the action to drive the transition. They have solutions, and that's why they need to be at the table. If you don't have them at the table, you won't have the necessary civil society support for the ambitious policies that we all know we need urgently. That's why we always say just transition for climate ambition. Just climate justice with just transition will drive climate ambition. The third part, and that's often That's a more complicated part for people, environmental negotiators from environment ministries, is the link with labor rights. At the ILO, all governments agreed on the fundamental principles and rights at work. These are the fundamental agreements that are needed to have governments protect the labor rights. There are several of these fundamental principles. The first one is the freedom of association. Workers need to be able to set up free and independent trade unions. Second, they need the right for collective bargaining, and organized workers have, of course, more power and need to be able to negotiate with their governments. Other fundamental rights at work refer to slave labor, child labor, and discrimination at work. And recently, last year, we also added all governments and employers and unions added safe and healthy working conditions as one of the fundamental rights at the ILO. And of course, this is also crucial in terms of climate protection. When heat stress affects people, floods affect people, these are fundamental labor rights that need to be protected when you deal with climate change. I'm just coming from a call with the Egyptian Federation of Industries that was discussing just transition policies. Imagine one of the only places that we have been able to discuss just transition with Egyptian civil society. And we see, for example, that in Egypt, these fundamental labor rights are not guaranteed. The ITUC makes every year a global index of how labor rights are respected, and Egypt is in our top 10 of worst countries. There are no setting up trade unions, setting up free trade unions is not guaranteed in India. Trade union representatives are being fired and being persecuted. Strikes are not being allowed, workers are being arrested, and so on. So this is an important issue for us, and we have raised it at the highest level in Egypt, and we will stress,
Can you still hear me? I'm just wondering if
yes, clear.
Okay, thanks, Taz. I think we lost Bert. Probably it's with his connection, but let's just wait for a few minutes for him to reconnect. But for our attendees, if you have any questions or any comments regarding the presentation of Bert, please use the chat button or raise your hand so we can unmute you. And if you can also add into the discussion, everyone is free to do that. Just raise your hand or use the chat button for any comments or suggestions. Again, this webinar is being recorded and is should be available in the social media accounts of the Asia-Europe People's Forum. Let's just wait for a few minutes for Bert. If not, I think we can proceed to our next speaker. So again, Bert has covered how the concept of just transition came about and how it started, how the group, the ITUC, has started to integrate it into the international climate talks, particularly in the Paris Agreement. He has mentioned that the core principle that they want to show in the Paris Agreement is that workers will have decent work and quality jobs as we transition to low carbon economies. And over the years, we have heard about the concept of just transition, and it has gained traction not only among us, civil society and climate activists, but also in policy documents that we see our governments in their respective discussion. So we have also heard about the need to transition to low carbon economies. And in order to do that, we have to ensure that our energy transition is rapid, just, and equitable. And I will now call on our next speaker, Tasneem, who is currently the executive director of CAN International and has been part of many international networks and organizations in the climate justice arena. And she is also the founding director of the Energy Democracy Initiative in South Africa. She will, okay, sorry about that. I can see Bert now connected. I'll introduce again Tasneem in a little bit. So I'll let Bert continue with his presentation, with his discussion from where he left off. I just summarized your some of the points that you've mentioned, Bert. So feel free to continue, and over to you.
Okay, huge apologies. I don't know what happened. My computer crashed and I needed help to set it up again. Sorry to be gone. I was indicating that I was in a call with the Egyptian government and the situation of labor rights in Egypt. And basically, this is what we see often at this moment. There is some kind of picking and choosing of just transition concepts. And what's being left out is often exactly this social dialogue aspect and labor rights aspect. Everybody likes to speak about leave no one behind, and we need a social dimension of climate policies. But when we speak about protecting and promoting labor rights and engaging actively with free trade unions, then many governments tend to back off in the discussion. And that's basically our priorities for COP27 also. We are very happy that many countries speak about just transition, but now we have to focus stronger on the labor and workers dimension in these climate policies. And we need it in the NDCs, we need it in mitigation, but also in adaptation and loss and damage, where we think that social protection is an important aspect of just transition, where the trade unions, together with the ILO and employers, have experience on setting up these universal systems of social protection. Like 44 billion people in the world do not have any social protection at all. How are you going to deal with the impact of climate change when you're affected with storms and loss of your livelihoods? Also, in terms of climate finance, we think that just transition should be integrated in the demands for climate finance. At COP26, there was a very good declaration signed by all the big donor countries on the international conditions for a just transition that refers very, very specifically to supporting workers, social dialogue, and so on. We need governments to pick up this declaration again and link it to the climate finance decisions that need to be taken at Sharm el-Sheikh. So if we look, for example, at the Just Energy Transition Partnerships deals that are on the agenda as an example of these just transition policies, we think that this climate finance is very important for the Global South to finance the transition, but it should be done in correct conditions. It's not just about raising the trillions of private capital, it's about having government control, real participation by national governments on these projects that are being done. That's why the Just Energy Transition Partnerships should be under the umbrella of the UNFCCC and not these shady deals done between the rich countries and certain developing countries. That's the main parts that I wanted to share with you on our priorities on just transition for COP27, and I'm happy to reply to any questions later that come up. Thank you, and apologies again for the interruption.
Thank you, Bert. So thanks, especially on that last note where you kind of linked our call on climate finance to demand climate finance to the global north. Also, not only for adaptation and mitigation, but also to ensure that the workers and laborers are also able to achieve decent work in that transition equation. Also, just to share, recently we have been in the Green Climate Fund meeting. You know what Green Climate Fund is. It is the financial mechanism under the UNFCCC, and happy to share that in Korea, it was held in Korea, and we contacted the International Center for Labor Solidarity, South Korea. So we invited Korean trade unions to actually join our actions outside of the Green Climate Fund board meeting, and we kind of shared with them why is it important that the trade unions join the demand for climate finance and for the entire climate justice campaign that we have. So happy to share that with you all. And yep, so again, for our attendees, if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat or use the Q&A function. Bert will be able to stay for a few minutes only. So if you have few questions to him, please do so in the Q&A function of the Zoom. Again, I'm going to introduce now our second speaker, who is, again, as mentioned, part of the many international networks and organizations in the climate justice arena. You may have heard her several times speaking in several interviews. And she's also the founding director of the Energy Democracy Initiative in South Africa. Without further ado, Tasneem Essop of the CAN International. Tasneem, over to you.
Thank you very much, Claire, and greetings to all joining us in this webinar, and very, very pleased to be in this webinar with my fellow panelists. So I am going to follow through from where Bert left off, and I will do a presentation. So just, Claire, can you give me screen sharing rights? It's been disabled.
Chad?
Okay.
There you go.
Great. Thank you very much. So, yeah. What I'm going to deal with is just, sharing thoughts on what some of the principles and a framework approach, and I will end off with some thoughts of immediate strategies to address the just transition. And I do want to say at the get-go that, and following through with what Bert said in an expanded way, that there can be no just transition without workers and communities at the table. And here I want to emphasize the additional point around communities being engaged in the just transition, because the Paris Agreement, as Bert says, of course, talks about workers' rights and ensuring workers are protected in a just transition. But if we step back and looked at where this just transition concept originated, as Bert said, in the labor movement in the 80s, it was really meant to apply to, a response to very disruptive change that happens in economies and societies. And in this instance, of course, we're talking in the 80s, they were responding to environmental disruption, but essentially where we are at now, using the concept of just transition, we are talking about global disruption due to climate change, which requires in turn a global radical transformation of our economies and societies. So certainly, you know, the expansion of that original intent and the expansion of what is addressed in the Paris Agreement so that it is far more wide and inclusive is the starting point that we would come at this as civil society. But the bottom line, and to emphasize what Bert has also said, if we're talking about just transitions, and the title of this webinar is really important, then to ensure justice, you must have workers and communities at the table. So based on that and thinking through, you know, the fact that what we're talking about when we talk about just transition is really about deep and transformational change in our societies and in our economies, I thought I'd present some initial guiding principles that in fact we developed during my period on the National Planning Commission in South Africa when we drove a social partner dialogue process in the country on the just transition. And these principles got generated out of that dialogue process. And so I'm going to share this with you just, you know, in the event that this could be useful as principles that guide the work that we will do on just transition. Of course, as an important starting point, just transitions must be just. As you said in the title, it's not inevitable. So this has to be worked for, fought for, and ensured. It has to be ethical and sustainable. That we must have the effective and democratic participation of all social partners. And here, Bert, I would add to, of course, ensuring the participation of workers, I would add, of course, more widely, a society-wide approach, and especially impacted communities, that we come at this just transition, whether locally or globally, from a starting point of human solidarity, something that we are losing more and more in this current multiple crises environment that we are facing in the world, that we look at an ecosystems approach as well, understanding that our human well-being is dependent on the well-being of the planet, that we look at applying a systems approach to this so that we are, you know, looking at, as we said, systemic transformations. We need to be dynamic and flexible because there's consistent emerging and new and emerging risks that we would have to be looking at all the time. So it's not a, we've done a just transition plan, it's drafted, this is a blueprint, and you know, we never look at it again. It really is process related and systemic related. And again, to repeat that it has to be transformative in nature. It's not a little piece of an exercise, but the result has to be transformative if we actually do proper just transition. And that it has to be planned for. I mean, there's a point now where we're probably running out of time because of where we are in the climate crisis, of having real deep, proper, proactive planning around this. And some of the measures are going to be reactive in nature, but essentially you need a managed transition to prevent and minimize massive disruption, as you can imagine. And then the issue that Bert raises around financing as well. Financing of the just transition should not add additional burdens to both people and country. And here particularly, I want to pause, for example, on the international financing cooperation that is required for just transitions. And you might know that, in fact, in Glasgow last year, there was an initiative set up between a few developed countries and South Africa called the Just Energy Transition Plan. And they're presenting this as a model for other countries and plan to roll out this model in other countries. Now, it's not been a very transparent partnership. There's been questions about, you know, so what is in fact this partnership about? What is going to be delivered in South Africa? What is this funding, 8.5 billion US dollars? What does it consist of? Well, finally, we've managed to get a leaked information that This $8.5 billion partnership essentially consists of at least only 2.7% made up of grant funding. The rest are loans. Now, if you put this in the context of a growing debt burden in developing countries, and these partnerships are going to be largely loan-based, then we really are adding additional burdens to countries and in turn its peoples. So certainly we have to interrogate, especially the international finance cooperation elements of these partnerships, and the very nature of these partnerships, whether they are in fact just in terms of our definition of just transitions. Bert mentioned the issue of social protection being guaranteed. We've added the concept of full cost accounting. So, there's all this modeling work that underpins some of the thinking for these just transitions. We believe that there has to be a full cost accounting approach so that we don't internalize externality costs, etc. So, I mean, these are just a set of principles that we could draw from to guide the work on a just transition. But what could the approach be? And here I really want to step back away from, in fact, the title you've asked me to speak about, because I don't believe that we can talk about energy transitions for a just transition on its own. So when we talk about just energy transitions, we believe it has to be located within an economy-wide and a society-wide approach and scope. You cannot have siloed energy transition plans because, as we know, there's a nexus if we take a systems approach, there's a nexus between energy and other systems. And so, you have to look at issues of land use, water, food systems, etc. So these other sectors in our economies will have to be part of a holistic approach to a just transition. So certainly that's the one point in terms of a framework approach that I would like to make. These can't be little just transition plans for each sector separately, but how do we all come together under a just transition as a holistic and systemic approach for structural change? And here again, reminding everybody that the nature of the crisis requires a radical transformation of our societies. And so certainly the issue of these transition plans being just, being equitable is critically important. As I said, there can be no just transition, for example, if workers and communities are not at the table. So we must ensure procedural justice. And part of the planning has to secure distributive justice. In other words, the kind of benefits of a transition has to be distributed equitably within society and within especially vulnerable sectors of that society. And it has to result in just outcomes. So ensuring justice, the eradication of poverty and inequalities at the center of these just transition plans is going to be important. It has to be transformative in nature and scale. Of course, transparency is key. And as I just mentioned, the Just Energy Transition Partnership for South Africa was not transparent, and only now are we starting to hear some of the problems, especially the financing model. So certainly it has to be transparent, inclusive, and the design of the processes must ensure that this is going to be the case. The design has to be thought through and collectively thought through to ensure that, and especially, for us to acknowledge that there's power and resource imbalances, that often in these processes, those that's well-resourced and have power are the ones that dominate negotiations and these processes. So we have to address the imbalance of power amongst social partners and put in place mechanisms to do that. Education, Bert has spoken about it. The just transition plans would have to include, in addition, plans for transforming the education system, for training that is required, and reskilling plans for workers and communities. And specifically, you know, there are going to be closures of coal-fired power stations, for example, closure of mines. And so there has to be negotiated labor and social plans also as part of the transition planning. And finally, we really do have to, as I said, this idea of solidarity, of social cohesion has to be the spirit in which we do this work, and also the outcome of a just transition process. And to say very clearly, these just transition processes are not technocratic. It is being turned into technocratic exercises at the moment, you know, lots of the kind of graphs and technical work that's being put, that's important, but actually transforming the systemic and structural transformation of our societies and economies is all about power. It's all about deep change, and it's not purely a technocratic exercise. So in terms of the strategy itself, again, I've warned, and Bert has warned, that unfortunately what we're witnessing now, you know, not only at the COPs, but also across the world, countries proclaiming that they're doing work on the just transition, we are starting to see that, in fact, the concept of a just transition that has emerged out of the labor movement is being captured. It's being corporatized, and it is being sanitized out of all of the issues of rights-based approaches, justice-based approaches, etc. And this is a huge risk. And we, as movements, would need to recapture the just transition again. And so what we would need is, of course, to build massive working class unity, which would include, of course, as Bert says, the workers. We must include the informal sector, because not everybody has a full-time job, the unemployed, there's rising unemployment across the world, and communities, and especially impacted communities living around those you know, mines and coal-fired power stations, etc., that would need to close down. So certainly we need to build wide working class unity, and this would require both the trade union and civil society movements across the board, not just the climate movement, but certainly across the board, you know, other movements. And we are allies in this work, and we need to work together to defend the original ideas behind just transition, and especially the justice element within the concept and processes of just transition. So I want to thank you for your time. I hope this has been useful, and very happy to take questions and engagement. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, Tasneem. That was very helpful. I personally would want to say that I find that your emphasis, because of saying that because of the nature of the crisis, of the multiple crises that we are facing, driven by the capitalist extractivist system, it is a requirement that we do a society-wide or holistic approach. And also you emphasize that there's really the requirement of joining forces between the trade union movement and the civil society as wide as possible. We have to join our forces to really ensure that we are going to that road of transitioning in a just way. Just before Tasneem and Bert goes, because they have very limited time, there are two comments in the chat box. So Said is saying, and I'm giving this to Bert and Tasneem, who are also very familiar with what's happening at the international climate talks. There's okay, Bert has answered already. Is there a binding on the Paris Agreement? Because many countries that endorse the agreement, they don't respect the workers' rights. And there's also a question from Sugat. There's also a comment from Sugat for highlighting the reciprocal relationship between trade unions and environmental or climatic issues and how they were initially forged. So, Taz, do you want to say something on comment made by Said or Bert?
No, just to acknowledge that that's the truth. And in fact, in many of these initiatives, as I said, they're leaving workers out of the processes. And Bert should be able to tell you more clearly, the one in South Africa has had no unions engaged they've put out, well, they haven't really put out an investment plan for that just energy transition partnership. Workers and communities have not been party to that, not been party to it. And in fact, they said they're going to put it out for comment. That's not just transition. That's not just transition. It's not meant to be the government will develop a plan somewhere and then they'll put it out in this usual tick box exercise, put it out for public comment. That's not what I think, we can, as I said in my presentation, that's not just transition. We have to be there at the start of these processes as a full and equal partner, workers and communities. So certainly, yeah, and the Paris Agreement, and this is in the preamble of the Paris Agreement, where the just transition is reflected. Yeah, it's not legally binding. And so this is a struggle. It has to be fought. And that's why I'm saying we need unity between civil society and trade unions to, push this very strongly. The recognition of workers' rights, the fact that trade unions need to be recognized and respected. And as Bert put in the chat, the ILO agreement is binding, in my understanding. And that gives much more detailed requirements for governments and employers especially. So certainly that's another good basis to start from.
Okay.
I can
How about Bert? Yes.
I can only repeat what Tasneem said. We see, for example, several NDCs of countries like Chile, Costa Rica, Colombia, Dominican Republic that have very nice chapters on just transition in their NDCs. And especially the pictures are nice of workers, but the language that's there, it has nowhere been consulted with the workers' organizations. And for us, it's very clear, if it's not consulted with the workers' organizations, it's not just transition. And this infrastructure to engage with free trade unions, to engage in social dialogue, to have collective bargaining sector by sector and on national level, they exist at the ILO, where there is also a mechanism, a committee on the application of norms, where countries that do not respect these labor rights have to comply, and there is a whole process building up on this. And Egypt is one of these countries that are under scrutiny, where they did some of the aspects, but not all of them. And yeah, I think we have to work much stronger together on this, and mobilizing workers and community organizations together to engage, put pressure on governments, respecting the respective objectives of the movements. Trade unions do not have to be environment organizations. Environment organizations do not have to be trade union organizations. Everybody should do his work. But we have clearly a very joint agenda and interest of stepping up the work together on these issues. That's what I wanted to share now.
Okay, thank you, Bert. So there are two more questions in the chat. Quickly, can there be a just transition under a neoliberal capitalist system? And also there's a concern particularly with working communities who may be impacted by mining for minerals for the energy transition and may be sacrificed if not included within this wider definition. I think the second one is more of like a concern raised by Andy Whitmore. So Taz or Bert, if you can say a few words. There's a question directly about, is it possible to have just transition in a neoliberal capitalist system?
I'm happy to reply no to that question. So it's very easy. if this neoliberal capitalist system does not recognize organized workers, organized labor, and does not want to have unions develop, yet then you cannot have a just transition. And that's why often people say, yeah, you're a nice bird to speak about social dialogue in Belgium and in Sweden and so on, but we are being shot in Colombia. So the other side of workers' action, of social dialogue, is of course social action, where workers have to organize with communities, with environmental organizations, with women and gender, indigenous people, and have to organize for this alternative model, that economic model that takes the social impact serious, and where there is a role for trade unions, for civil society organizations, and where human rights and labor rights are being protected. So that's the condition that's needed for any economic model that can deliver on the climate challenges that we're faced with.
Okay,
Could
so
I just add to that, Claire, just very
Yes,
briefly,
please.
just to agree with Bert. And of course, you know, that's why the title of this webinar is so important, you know, that justice is not inevitable. And it's exactly for that reason that we should recognize that the fight for a just transition is not technocratic. It really is about system change. That's it. Radical system change. And so we have to use this opportunity of an existential crisis of climate to change the system from a neoliberal capitalist system. And that is exactly why we have a much wider, expanded understanding of just transition. It's not these, you know, sectoral agreements, etc., but has to be deeply systemic. So we have to move away from a neoliberal capitalist system, because essentially the neoliberal capitalist system has caused the crisis in the first place, and these other, you know, multiple crises. So that is essentially, and it's going to be a struggle. This is not going to be, you know, something that's going to be won easily, and hence my view that we need working class unity to have the struggle against the neoliberal capitalist system.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, Taz and Bert. We'll have to move on to our next speaker. I will now have to call on Shalmali Guttal, who is also who is the executive director of the Focus on the Global South, and she will discuss more about the framework and strategies to securing food sovereignty and the rights of our rights to food and to decent and healthy food. I'm now turning over to you, Shal. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Claire. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So I didn't prepare a PowerPoint, but I made some notes to share with all the participants. So in the area of food and agriculture, I think the biggest problem that we face regarding just transition is the global industrial food system. Now, this might seem very obvious, but I think there is a very close relationship between what's happening in this industrial food system and the concepts and the values and the politics that we want to uphold in just transition. Now, this global industrial food system is one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions and to environmental destruction, to water contamination, to the exploitation of workers, and to the dispossession of small-scale food producers, and also, of course, to public health crises and malnutrition that we're seeing. And many agricultural workers and many migrant workers are those who have been dispossessed from lands at some point or the other. Of course, there are many, many generations by which, after several generations, everybody who is not left the land and gone to work in industry is necessarily a previous agricultural worker. But we are seeing, for example, a very large proportion of migrant workers and workers in the informal sector in rural areas are actually those who were farming or fishing or livestock raising, and they are being dispossessed and they are being exploited by this system. Now, this global industrial food system operates through global value and supply chains. And every stage of these chains entail extensive use of agrochemicals, fossil fuels and energy, and this from monocultural production in the fields to processing, storage, packaging, transportation, and retailing. So actually production at the field level is a small part, just one part of this global value chain driven, global so-called global food system. And there are workers involved in every other aspect of that chain. And I think those of you who work with workers and are in unions, and also globally, we can see with the contractualization of work and the informalization of work, what's happening to workers in this kind of globalized value chain food system. Workers are often, especially in the food and agriculture sectors, some of the most unprotected, most endangered workers. And I think it was the Food and Agriculture Organization itself which said that agriculture is actually one of the most dangerous occupations for workers. Now, another important thing about this global industrial food system is it's highly concentrated. It's concentrated in terms of crops, seeds, production inputs and machinery. Many of the poorest and most food insecure countries depend on a small number of countries, other countries that produce staple grains for export. Globally, global grain trade and production input markets are dominated by a small number of firms in almost fully financialized commodity markets, which are then prone to volatility. And we have seen this volatility and food commodity speculation accompanying every food crisis, and we're in the middle of another food crisis now. Now, a small number of corporations exercise a very high degree of influence over the global industrial food systems. And of course, they are powered by mergers and acquisitions of each other. They form giant mega corporations, which then allows them further concentration horizontally and vertically, as well as influence over policy making and governance, both nationally and globally. So the big fight that workers have, and small-scale food producers and fishers and livestock owners, and have the big fight that they have on their hands to secure their rights, in terms of decent and safe production systems and methods, and remunerative prices, which cover the cost of production, fair living wages, shelter, the ability to be able to access social protection, not only in the quest of the poorest of the poor, but social protection as a right for all people who are producing the food of this world, whether they are producing it through production directly or through processing and other activities along the value chain. This social protection is completely absent, and corporations who are concentrating the global food system have a lot to do with this denial of rights. Now, I think the other important aspect about concentration and the expansion and the expanding power of this sort of corporate dominated industrial food system is that it is predicated on food import dependency among low income and even middle income countries of the South, and whose economies, domestic economies and food systems were already devastated by colonialism. So the focus on a few staple crops to feed commodity markets during the colonial era. This continues today, and it has eroded traditional diets, and it has left countries heavily reliant on imports for what are now their staple foods. So in many countries, also cash crops have taken the place of more diverse food crops and also the more important, nutritionally important food. And we see that even after decolonization, since decolonization, many low-income countries and former colonized countries remain stuck as providers of raw materials, labor, and markets to the corporations of former colonizers. So another aspect now, which is very important as part of our just transition discussion, is the issue of structural adjustment programs and very high levels of external debt, which have placed many low and middle income countries into classic debt traps, which are then exacerbated by natural disasters, by floods, by crises, by wars and conflicts. I think the other speakers have pointed this out, but I'll just emphasize again how neoliberalism, privatization, deregulation, re-regulation in favor of corporations, and then the financialization of food and nature and free trade and investment agreements have resulted in deepening the dependency of nations on this global industrial food market at the cost of rebuilding and revitalizing local and national food systems. So just a few more minutes to just say, okay, what's to be done then? I mean, I just put a few points there. No? So for transition to be just, it has to be functional at levels and scales where values of correcting historical wrongs and injustices, and where values of environmental restoration, respect for human life, respect for work, respect for nature, human and collective rights, and reparations for past violence and dispossessions, all these can be monitored in real time, in very real terms. And course correction has to be an essential component of transition pathways. And I think both the speakers before me talked about how there are these plans for just transition that have been put on the table, but without any involvement of workers, without any involvement of those who are laboring. Similarly, we are seeing a lot of proposals for climate responsive transition in agriculture and food systems, which absolutely do not involve neither the workers nor the producers of any kind. So just to reemphasize this point, no transition will be just without this kind of real-time monitoring of the issues of justice and course correction to be able to, available to change these plans, as we monitor them. Another point here that in terms of moving forward is, I think it's really important that we start working to deconcentrate the global agro-industrial food system. And this, of course, is a big challenge because the structures that hold up this industrial food system were established more than 100 years ago, during colonial eras. Now, process of financialization that have happened subsequently in the last, say, 30, 40 years have really chained countries to this very volatile, ecologically destructive, human exploitative economic system. And of course, another challenge in deconcentrating the industrial food system is the tremendous power of corporations in national and food governance. So I would say that, we have to work at multiple levels in this deconcentration. And at a very practical level, the weakest links of this global system are at local, subnational, and sub-regional levels. And that's where I think very practically, we as people of the world, whether we are, whether we are support organizations, civil society activists who accompany workers and social movements and small-scale food producers, we work together to rebuild and revitalize local national food and ecosystems. We build up food sovereignty from the ground up, but we also build out, widen, and elaborate further the idea of food sovereignty. Agroecology is extremely important here, because if food isn't grown in healthy, safe environments through healthy, safe methods, no producer, no worker is safe. It's not just about consumers, it's about those who are actually in those fields producing that food, whether they own the land or they're working for somebody else. Equally important here is commons-based governance of land, water, forests, and natural territories. Because what we're seeing now with land, with water, with forests is this parceling out and commodification and breaking territories up to hand them over to corporations for more industrial production, food production. Short food chains are really important so that we can break this global these long chains of globally traded food, which have huge greenhouse gas impacts. And these short food chains would require producer, worker, consumer collaboration, solidarity, working through cooperatives, through territorial markets, that is, markets that are attached, place-based markets, and through local innovations. We need dietary diversity through restoring native foods and sharing and exchanging of local seeds and breeds and so on. I mean, if you look at the discourse of what's happening with nutrition, for example, corporations and number of governments are pushing, for example, food fortification. So idea being that you fortify food and you give workers and you give producers and you give those who labor food products rather than actual food, And again, this goes back to the concentration of a few staple crops, But those staple crops are susceptible to volatile price volatility and price shocks. And through processing, we end up with ultra-processed foods, which may meet calorific values, but do not provide nutrition and create other problems for those who are consuming them. I think protection of landscapes and territories through collective governance systems are very important, and these should not favor producers over workers and indigenous peoples. Because I think there has to be this acceptance that producers, workers, indigenous peoples, women, youth, everybody is in this together. We're all in this together, And so when we're talking about protection of landscapes and territories, we have to find collective systems that will, that actually involve the agency of all these actors. I think the issue of technology and financial resources are tricky, because on one hand, we need appropriate and advanced technology to build infrastructure for shorter food and economic circuits. At the same time, we know that high technology is being used by corporations in wealthy countries for the so-called climate, smart agriculture and nature-based solutions, precision agriculture, soil carbon trading, genetically modification of seeds and breeds and so on. And none of these actually result in the reduction of greenhouse gases. Instead, they expand the capitalist frontiers through offsets and markets. So I think we need a lot more dialogue and discussion on technology and financial resources. But we definitely do need to pull governments to our side to redirect finances and resources to build public sciences, public procurement, infrastructure, so that we can support local food systems and territorial markets. And we need legislators and governments to change regulation and policies to protect the rights of workers, small-scale producers, indigenous people, with special attention to women and young people. And a very important aspect of freeing up these resources, of course, is debt cancellation. And outright debt cancellation, not debt restructuring, not debt for nature swaps and so on, but actual cancellation, so that we, countries of the South have the resources available to be able to put into strong, robust social protection systems and, systems that support food sovereignty. Financing by wealthy countries, which are the former colonizers, for building domestic food sovereignty and agroecology are really important as reparations for colonialism and repayment of ecological debt, not as aid or aid for trade or as charity. And, this is why, which points to actually the importance of removing corporations from food governance altogether. And here, I think the world, of course, has a lot to learn from the labor movement internationally, because the labor movement actually challenged corporations and spoke, confronted the power of corporations, rather than trying to compromise in any way with them. So I'll just stop here. In closing, all I want to say is that food sovereignty as a right to appropriate healthy nutrition food, culturally appropriate food, and the rights of people to determine their own food, and nutrition policies. This is not a paradigm only for those who own land or the ability to produce. This is a paradigm that is needed for everybody and a very essential part of just transition. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shal. So, again, many thanks for all your input on to cover the the element on achieving food sovereignty and ensuring the right to, as you have said, culturally sensitive and healthy, nutritious food for all. Um, Over the course of our discussion, we have heard that in order to achieve just transition, there must be great labor and social plans to secure the jobs and livelihoods of people. And I think it is appropriate to hear from a labor organizer himself. I will now call on our last but not the least speaker, Luke Espiritu, who is the president and the labor organizer of BMP, Bukluran ng Manggagawang Pilipino in the Philippines, or Solidarity of Filipino Workers. So I now turn over to you. Over to you, Luke.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And good evening, everyone. Um, now, I was glad to hear a while ago from Bert that the origins of the just transition came about because of the intervention of workers in response to the disruption caused by climate change. And I would just like to explore the question on what is the intervention further of the labor movement, because climate just transition has evolved through the years. And I heard a while ago that it has also been hijacked or co-opted. It was started by the workers, but hijacked and co-opted, specifically by the business owners in order to push for their own model of what a transition should be. I think we all understand that transition is already a phenomenon, and the capitalist class and the property owners are simply forced also to adjust and shift from the old method or the old means of accumulating their wealth, from a low carbon type of business production towards a more modern, which is already a call for the times, more modern, low carbon type of production and wealth accumulation. And it is an agenda for the property owners to effect that kind of a transition. And not the least is in order to preserve their status in society and ensure that that transition will preserve certain property rights or property relations. And therefore, we do understand, we from the labor movement understand that just transition is a question on who determines the transition. And it's a very workers to the property owners and the capitalists that they determine the transition. More likely than not, it will be with dire consequences for the workers, because any transition for that matter from one system to another will always be paid by exploitation of the workers. We have known about the concept of primitive capital accumulation. When the capitalist class has taken over the primitive means, and that would entail the pauperization of the workers. And so is true with any type of transition within the very same capitalist system that we have. Any type of transition, the disruption that results from it, it is always borne by the workers. And it will result in the exacerbation of the labor conditions, the dire labor conditions that they already experience. Transition, if left to the property owner, will result in more precarious work, more extraction of surplus value from the workers, less job security, and less respect for the right of workers to self-organization, as the capitalists are adjusting to a different type of a system and would need some security for the preservation or the accumulation of the starting capital in order to make the transition. So it is a question of who leads the transition. And for us in the labor movement, it is all clear that if there is any transition that must be done, it must be determined by the proletariat, by the workers, who must lead and define and determine the type of transition that we must have. Meaning to say, to put a proletarian imprint into the type of transition that we must have. And when we talk about just transition, all our demands, which is actually for the protection of all of those that are more affected by climate change, we actually could already envision that kind of a transition, which the work in response to our crisis. That is, in order to preserve the livelihoods, not only of the worker, the livelihoods of those vulnerable sectors, in order and preserve job security, social protection, and this is the type of transition that we must need. And secondly, just transition for us, aside from being a question of who leads the transition, is also a question of how fast should we make the transition. If left to the, that's why we are problematic about whether we could reach the target of 1.5 degrees Celsius in the heating of our planet by 2030. Because if left to the property owner, the pace of the transition will be very, very slow, because to profit, it is a transition in order to preserve their mode of accumulating wealth, transitioning from one energy system to another. And we understand in the labor movement that this transition is time bound, because science cannot wait. There are scientific findings already in regard to the effects of climate change, about the irreversibility of the effects of climate change if we do not reach our target within a certain frame of time. So for us in this just transition is also answering the question of how fast it is. It must be as fast as it could be, because our problems are time bound and we do not have the luxury of time. Just transition is also a question of system, as I do agree with the speaker a while ago. It's a question about system. It will disturb us within our society, and it is so interconnected that even if you transition from one energy system to another in that certain area, it will affect the entire society. It will affect property of the property owners. It will affect business interest of those who are in coal, in dirty energy. It will affect, in fact, the way that the business owner will produce, because definitely production for profit, which is the culprit behind climate change, must also change into a different type or purpose for production. From production for profit, then we see very clearly that production more for need than for profit, with that kind of a framework, is what is needed for us to have a just transition. And having realized this, and have this being very clear for the workers' movement, it is important at this stage for the workers' movement to take on the cause of just transition among the many other causes that the workers' movement have historically engaged in. The workers' movement is historically has already determined the type of strategy in order to change society. Historically, part of that strategy is actually to lead the democratic movement, lead the democratic changes in society, in order to pave the way for a systemic type of change. And if we look at our climate emergency right now, when we talk about just transition, in actual fact, we are actually pointing towards a different type of society. I don't know if just transition is implemented fully, if it would be the same type of capitalism that we will already see, or it is a different system altogether, which is more humane, which will respect the finite limits of our resources, which will conserve our resources, and which will produce for our own needs rather than for profit. And this long-standing strategy of the workers' movement, which is to lead the democratic movement for the purpose of systemic change. This must take on the climate issue as part and parcel. In fact, one of the main area wherein the worker will have to use its collective force and its class force in order to lead the democratic struggle in our society. And for that, it is important for us to achieve just transition, that the workers in their own organizations, they must not only unite, but actually level up from the present level of general decline that it has experienced in the past decades, that it must be able to rediscover its own collective strength, its class strength, and rediscover the type of organizations that it has already seen in the past, and put forward a proletarian type of just transition in our society. And this leads us to the question of, is social dialogue enough in order for us to have just transition? I, for one, believe that this is not simply a question of social dialogue. It is a question of class struggle, and the workers must bring class struggle into the fight for just transition. Thank you very much. And if there are any questions, I'm open to answer those questions.
Thank you very much, Luke. So I love how Luke has broke down the concept of just transition as to who leads, and definitely he has mentioned that it's really the working class who will lead this systemic transformation. How fast? He emphasized the urgency of the matter, and that we do not have the luxury of time. And also the interlinkages of the transformation needed. And lastly, he also posed the challenge for the workers' movement to really lead the democratic changes in our society for this systemic change. So thank you very much for that. Again, I would like now to invite all our attendees to pose any questions, any comments that you may want to share with us tonight in this webinar session. So I'm now opening the floor for questions, comments, and other insights from our attendees, as well as from our speakers, if you want to elaborate more on the points that we have raised earlier. Again, the Q&A function of the Zoom is open for any questions from our attendees or clarifications. We can also use the chat button in case you want to share something. Yes, panelists. Taz, yeah, you have the floor, please.
Thanks very much. And sorry to jump in. I thought maybe while people are waiting to put their questions, but I have a question to Luke, actually. And I want to thank you, Luke, for your presentation. And ending off with a very powerful point that this just transition is about class struggle, which I completely support. So I'd like to know your thoughts on a trade union movement that is currently very focused on, you know, the kind of ILO guidelines on a just transition. To be honest, in my view, and I've had challenging debates about this, I think that is a very narrow perspective for the kind of transformational change that we're talking about. So it does put it in a very narrow, almost collective bargaining perspective. And I support collective bargaining is necessary in many parts of that class struggle, but it cannot be the sum total of our approach to a just transition. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about that, how you deal with an ILO guideline that is being really pushed by the International Trade Union movement and this wider idea that you've presented, that this is essentially about class struggle?
Look,
I totally agree. But this type of approach in the labor movement is long-standing. As there are part of the labor movement would be those sectors that would push for reform as the main and essential way of advancing changes in society. And reform is simply it's a result of being ready to confront in his struggle with the forces in our society who control all the wealth and who control the economy. Labor perspective with respect to just transition. And I think the ILO type of a framework, though important, we do not diminish the value of reforms in just transition. That are being pushed in order to become part of a just transition plan. We do not diminish or dismiss the value of this. But the framework is, for me and for many others in the labor movement who belong to the systemic change type of a framework, reforms are simply a way in order to make vital, far-ranging changes in our system. And it is not reform for reform's sake. It is in order to march forward in quantitative changes, but then it should lead to a break, a qualitative break in the situation. And I think that is one of the things that regarding its own strategies and tactics in regard to just transition. And there will be debates. And I hope as the labor movement gets deeper in its involvement in just transition, we would be able to see or forge a more effective path.
okay, thank you very much for that, Luke and Taz. So we are running out of time. We have 4 minutes left. And I see no questions from our attendees or even in the chat. Before we go, I will just like to request our speakers to just give us a few remarks before we end our webinar for today, just to leave some thoughts to ponder our attendees before we end our webinar on just transition. I know the concept of just transition is not a very popular term for everyone, but this webinar has been very helpful in really unpacking what the concept means. So I would like to request maybe we can start with Shal to just leave a few remarks before we end our webinar on the topic for this webinar session. Shal, and then anyone can go. It's probably you can go Look or Taz. It's up to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Claire, and thank you to all the speakers. It's been a pleasure and an honor to be here with all of you. I think in closing, the only thing that I'd like to put on the table is that, the systems that we are dealing with, which have led us to this crisis point, and for which various, I don't know, what shall I say, blueprints are being put on the table. by policymakers, by officials, and actually by a number of international so-called experts and so on. They don't touch on a few very key things, key issues. One is, okay, we have already way past the tipping point because, as Luke said, I mean, there's an urgency to the entire climate disaster and the climate catastrophe, right? So we're already way past the tipping point. So at this point, what is it that humankind must do absolutely as an ethical, political imperative to be able to ensure that at least future generations and even current generations who are there are able to get through these crises with dignity and with being able to survive and not just be have to eke out some kind of immiserated living. And I think that piece, that this aspect is I don't see it in any of the transition scenarios that I put forward. That's one. Another thing that I think is missing really is the issue of rights. Rights, justice are completely missing. We have a lot of discussion about the importance of North-South, which of course is there. I myself invoked it in my talk about it. But within our own countries, within our own societies, we deal with such unequal systems and such exploitative systems that we forget that there is a North-South dynamic in our own, in our own societies. And I think I agree with Luke. I think basically the entire transition process, whoever it involves, definitely workers, of course, but also the small scale producers, also the indigenous, also women, wars, people living under occupation, this entire scenario has to be a class struggle. And I think we a lot of the terminology that's being used on transitions and so on and so forth, in a way tries to depoliticize the issues of class, the issues of discrimination, the issues of racism, the issues of occupation, the huge climate and the justice bill of wars and occupations and violence and dispossession. It just sort of tries to so I think those politics have to be put back on the table, and I think without those politics, we're just going to be going around in circles again, with what was in the Paris Agreement and the NDC and this target. Those are diversionary tactics. So I think we need to all come together across sectors and movements with a much, much clearer political vision. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Shaz. Maybe Luke can come in again.
Yes, I come from a place or a country wherein the workers have a lot to achieve in their struggle for a better society. And we have been outstripped, all of these concerns have been outstripped by a greater, more serious threat to humanity, which is the climate crisis. And the way I see it is we have not yet come in step with the development, with the challenges to the workers and the workers' movement. And one of the challenges with the workers' movement is actually to be able to respond effectively to this problem, which already slaps us in the face very clearly that the problem is capitalism. And how do we change this capitalist type of a society which has destroyed our planet? And how the workers are the force that should actually stand up and level up in order to confront and face this monster and be able to lead the struggle against this destructive force in our society. These are questions that the workers' movement must still be able to answer and must still be able to address. There's a long road for the workers' movement. And I hope that our discussion today and our interaction will also help in the preparation of the workers as a class force to finally become the force that will change society, the revolutionizing force that will build a more humane and an environmentally sound and healthy society. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that. Look, Taz, final words.
Thank you very much. Thanks. And I really want to thank Charles and Luke for their closing comments now, and I'm absolutely aligned with it. And I am so happy, especially to hear, the presentation of the issue of class struggle. And yeah, I think, Luke, the challenge isn't just for the working class, the workers' movements, but for all movements. I head a global network who also fall into the traps of what's being presented in this depoliticized way on the just transition, right? And I do want to support Charles' point about recognizing and always acknowledging the North-South dynamic in approaches and many of the kind of politics that emerge around the just transition. I come from in my very, very long past history, I come from the trade union movement in South Africa. And certainly for us then, it was, we fought for this being a class struggle against capitalism. And as you said, we had the ideas of what that future would need to look like. And I think the challenge for all of us being led by the workers' movement is to now figure out where we're transitioning to. We all talking about the just transition, but very little has been actually pulled together. It's in bits and pieces about where we want to be at the end of a transition, what's that vision? And here again, I believe that the workers, and especially global South workers movement, I want to, because I'm exposed to the divergent views in the workers' movements, that the working workers' movement from the global South should lead us, the wider working class, and then also, behind that, civil society formations, etc., in the development of also where we're transitioning to. What is that vision for the future? And you and Shalm and others have already brought in the pieces of such a future we would like, but it would be really great if we could work together and unite around this vision for where we want to transition to.
Thank you very much again to everyone, to Taz, to Luke, to Shalmali. Unfortunately, Bert has to leave early, but thank you. This webinar has been very informative and very inspiring. You are all very inspiring, especially as we count the days to COP27, where governments will again talk about just transition, but they don't really understand what the concept really means and often exclude putting the workers and the communities at the core of the concept of just transition. So thank you. This has been very helpful. I will not hold you more any longer. So thank you also to all our attendees. Please expect that there will be succeeding emails or materials from us on just transition that we want to share to everyone, that you can also share to all your partners, networks, and allies. Thank you again, and good day to everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.